Welcome to Fintech Chatter, presented by Tier 1 People, leaders in fintech executive search. Follow us on your favorite podcast player or Fintech Chatter TV on YouTube.
Welcome to part 3 of our 3-part Fintech Chatter series recorded live from the British Consulate in Sydney. I'm your host, Dexter Cousins. Back in 2018, I began supporting the work of the UK Department of Business and Trade in their efforts to establish a UK-Oz fintech bridge. Each year, a UK Fintech Mission heads down under as part of Intersekt Week. It's a fantastic opportunity not only to showcase what Australia has to offer, but to learn from our UK cousins. So over this 3-part series, I'm bringing interviews with the delegates, sharing their insights, experiences, and their thoughts to the Australian fintech community. In this final episode, I chat to 2 UK companies who have already launched in Australia. Nick Briscoe, Australia Country Manager for Currency Cloud, and Robbie McDiarmid, Country Manager for CMSPI, share their challenges, the opportunities, and their tips on how to launch in Oz. Before we speak to Nick and Robbie, if you've just discovered the show, please consider following us on your podcast player and leaving a review. It really helps others like you discover the show. And if you're coming back, thanks so much for your support. Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Fintech Chatter podcast. This is the podcast for all things fintech down under. Joined today by 2 really cool guests, Nick Briscoe from Currency Cloud and Robbie McDiarmid from, you're going to have to help me out here, Robbie. When it's more than 3 letters, I can never get it right.
Yeah. CMSPI. I didn't choose the name. So yeah, it's a tough one.
It's actually, I can't believe it's actually a year gone since I was in this room with both of you, and we were having another podcast and having a very similar discussion. But I guess the reason why the discussion is similar is because there are inherent challenges and opportunities through launching in Australia. And we've seen in the last 12 months, some businesses have been successful, some have not. And so today is really, I guess, to give you a warts and all kind of account of what it's like, the nuance to the types of businesses. I think you mentioned in the presentation that we see B2B businesses a little bit more successful here than, say, B2C. But that doesn't mean to say that you won't be successful. There's just, I guess, some different approaches that are required. But Nick, maybe if you could start off with Currency Cloud and a little bit about the business and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So Currency Cloud is a provider of financial infrastructure and specifically multi-currency accounts and cross-border payment solutions for banks, brokers and fintechs. So very much in the B2B sector. We do not service individual consumers or SMEs or corporate customers. Business is just over a decade old and really a UK Fintech success story, having been acquired by Visa back in December 2021. I've been with the organisation for a bit over 18 months. So just after the acquisition occurred, I started in January 2022 and first employee here in Australia and really established the business, got a licence in place, started to build out the team here in Australia whilst also building out the client base that was already pre-existing in the business.
Great. And Robbie, can you tell us a little bit about you and CMPSI? SPI, yeah. Right, I need to write that down, guys.
So Robbie McDiarmid, I head up our consulting team at CMSPI. So we started as a cash management firm actually in the UK for the large supermarkets in the UK and their foreign exchange bureaus. So ordering the right cash at the right time and vice versa. We realized, or we got questions about this newfangled thing called credit cards and how we might be able to accept those as a UK supermarket. And so we started kind of delving into the space, and payments has obviously exploded since then into digital. So we've grown now to 6 offices globally, into the US, into Europe, and into Asia Pacific now, where we have Sydney as our hub for our APAC operations. But fundamentally, what we do is we support merchants, so again, very much in the B2B space, to optimize their payments arrangements. Who should they work with and how should they work with them to be able to deliver the best experience for their customers in their B2C channels. So we've been working on Australia for probably about 5 years now, maybe 3 years of direct focus on it, and just over a year now of being on the ground and setting up with local clients.
So a year ago, I think you on the podcast, you've been here for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So first of all, congratulations on making it through your first year. You're in the top 10%. What's that experience been like, Robbie?
I think because we'd done essentially 2 years of market scoping, and we had the existing business in the UK, Europe, and the US, we started off with our multinational clients, expanded into Australia, and essentially, suggested we could support them in this market as well as what we're doing elsewhere in the world. From that international piece, that allowed us to get a decent chunk of projects and clients that we were working with at the time. But then actually landing, everything leading up to that point had been facilitating discussions with the domestic merchants that we really wanted to work with, to be able to say, we truly are in the Australian market here. So upon actually landing, one of the things we found during obviously the pandemic, you have virtual discussions are still very valuable. But we found that the Australian market in particular does like to meet and discuss and, make things happen in that way. So after landing, we had quite a kind of successful first few months immediately after, because it had been 2 years worth of work that all landed in a hectic 2 or 3 week period where we were out and about meeting everybody and essentially finalizing before moving on. So it's been busy. And then I know we were going to talk about the kind of sales cycle here as well. It was very, very busy, August, September, October. And then November, December, January, you go straight back to everyone on their summer holidays down here. So
there's a saying in Australia that between the Melbourne Cup and Australia Day, we go into shutdown. And it's not quite that, but there is definitely a slowdown. Yeah,
there's different types of people and different organizations that you'd work with best during that time. But certainly for us, we found that the sales piece slows down in the summer months here.
Now, Nick, we've seen various staged organizations with various, I guess, levels of capital to be able to throw at Australia. And it's not necessarily made a difference whether you've got huge amounts of capital or not. What's it been like for you having the kind of visa acquisition? Has that been a help, or has it been something that's been perhaps a challenge?
I think in the early stages, it didn't really make that much difference because it was so soon after the completion of that transaction. So it was very much business as usual for Currentsclad in terms of the expansion. As a more mature organisation now here in Australia, sort of 18 months in and maybe 12 months into being regulated, it's a massive tailwind very, very clearly because it gives us that brand awareness. We've gone through a period now where obviously interest rates have gone from zero to more normal interest rates. And that's obviously negatively affected quite a few fintech organisations and made people more focused on their counterparty risk as well. Yeah. So that has very clearly been a tailwind for us as I think the 9th largest organisation, or publicly traded anyway, in the US. So, as I said, I think in those early stages, it hasn't had a big impact. Where it has certainly had an impact at the later stage as well is probably, and this probably depends on the audience, whether you're regulated or not regulated, but certainly for a regulated institution who is looking to obtain banking services here in Australia, that's another key consideration about what type of organisation you are, what type of risk profile you present to a bank here in Australia, and how that presents is super important, and how that's executed upon. And again, that is another area where very clearly we have the expertise and the financial resources to maintain an appropriate compliance framework and therefore give our banking partners comfort around that.
No, Robbie, you talked before about lots of meetings. I think it's probably one of the reasons why the coffee is so good in Australia is because we're always in coffee shops doing meetings. What have you found has been the challenge around kind of getting the name out there and just building those relationships And I'm interested because you've spent a year here now, and I just reflect on my own personal experience, landing in Australia nearly 20 years ago. And I remember people saying to me, we're going to wait 12 months to see if you're still here. Have you found that experience as well?
Yeah, no, it's certainly been interesting. I think the kind of the meetings piece for us was a lot of business here is still relationship driven. And so building relationships over a long period of time or getting recommendations and referrals from existing clients was really important. And so starting from effectively zero and then trying to build is the toughest part of that. And then once you have things set up, it can kind of continue under its own steam. We found that the international client piece was very helpful in establishing a credibility. It has taken time, and getting the momentum was difficult. Finding the right conferences to attend, I think Intersekt is a great one, particularly for those that are looking to sell to tier 1, tier 2 banks, and RegTech, InsurTech, and all the rest. And so for us, kind of finding those conferences where we're able to then get the networking and discussions has been super helpful. And we just recently broke even as well. And in our kind of model, we deliver all of our work up front and then paid over a long period of time. So we're going to be here for a good while longer.
Nick, have you found with that you need to have operations here to give customers comfort, particularly with things like time zone differences?
That's probably been less of a problem for us. We have an operations team that continues to be built out of a Singapore hub as well, so it's probably less of a consideration. It's more to Robbie's point about just having people on the ground. Being able to go out there and press the flesh, have a coffee or have a beer is super important. It probably will not surprise any of you here in the audience or listening that Australians can be quite direct, and that sort of has two sides to it. Normally they'll give you both barrels if you've done something wrong, but the second component is you really want to get to the heart of the matter, and particularly around commercial discussions, you can do that very quickly and easily over a coffee and a beer. So it does make it a very good place to do business, and there's not a lot of sort of faffing around in this sort of dance around things. You can get to the heart of the matter quite quickly, but again, that needs to be done in person. Very hard to do that over a video call, although we did persist through that during COVID, but times have changed and people definitely want to meet in person.
I call you Blue-Eyed Unicorn, I think, on a podcast that we did. And it's really, I think, in reference to the challenges that you have in finding the right person to be a country manager, that first person on the ground. It's unique. It's kind of, you're there to, can be the pioneer for the business. And there's a lot of challenges, right? Not just particularly for somebody like yourself, Robbie, coming to a new country, but you also have the time zone challenges as well.
Yep.
How have you both found the experience of being that first person on the ground? And maybe it's Robbie, if I can start with you.
Yeah, it was. It's an interesting one, and it's always the case that Australia is the weird time zone, quote, rather than
I
other
thought that was New Zealand.
Well, New Zealand's even worse. Yeah, exactly. So it's challenging. It's possible though. There's crossover with our US East Coast team. West Coast team is even better for crossover in the morning. Europe, you can catch it 5 or 6 or so. But I think there's two sides to that as well. You also have an entire part of your day where you're not contactable by the rest of the world at all, and you can get on with your Australian work in the meantime. So I think it is an interesting point, because we landed with a team of 3 that came out for kind of permanent full-time staff that were all experienced in the existing business, and that worked to help us kind of manage the transition from, at least, keep some parts of the business the same. Yes, we're kind of learning and expanding into a new market, but keep the core elements of the project team processes and how you do things equivalent until you find those differentiators that are required for the Australian market. And then kind of from there now being able to tack on local hiring to give that kind of additional experience to bring us to, the full domestic level. So, it was interesting landing as kind of the one first. Certainly a learning experience. But you need, your kind of rest of the world teams to very much understand the time zones. It can be a long day in Australia if you've got a global business.
And Nick, how have you found it? Because obviously now you're a much larger business, wouldn't necessarily say you're a startup. So I'd assume there's a few more kind of layers and stakeholders to manage. How have you found the experience so far?
Yeah, really good, to be honest with you. And I think for anybody coming into that sort of role, obviously that first hire is really super important for an expansion. They need to sit across a whole range of different areas, and particularly if you're a regulated business. But as our colleagues from Austrade pointed out, if you ultimately are selling, even if you're not regulated yourself, but you're selling into regulated businesses, it is possibly front of mind before commercials with a lot of organisations in Australia. So if you're not sensitive to it, you're going to have problems. And I mention that because those first few hires, and particularly the first hire, needs to be sensitive to governance, the regulatory framework, the environment the clients are operating in. If you are regulated yourself, obviously you have the skills and qualifications to sit on that license as a responsible officer. And at the same time, be focused on probably the most important thing, the lifeblood of the organisation, which is revenue and growing that business. Pretty hard sort of mix of skills to balance as a person, but then kind of harder to find in a person as well when you're recruiting here in Australia. From a personal perspective, I kind of enjoyed it and have enjoyed that startup phase. I think it helps, again, to have come from a background if you've worked in a global organisation already. The thought of getting on a call at 8 or 9 p.m. at night, Sydney time, isn't so much of a stress. You kind of appreciate the freedoms. As Robbie mentioned, that nobody's going to hassle you from 8 o'clock till 11 o'clock in the morning. So having that sort of background, I think, helps. And I think certainly the first few employees, important that they recognise they're in a global business, and happy to work in around that to ensure that it's a success.
What's it been like the last 12 months in actually putting together a team, local team?
Yeah, I think we've lent quite a bit on the DBT team for initial introductions. And there is a good network of kind of recruitment support in Australia as well, which I think is necessary, because we had an attempt to do it ourselves, found that it was very difficult to match up the skills we wanted with the salary ranges we were seeing, with what we needed within the team. So having that local support was really important there. But now ultimately, looking to maintain and grow the current team in Australia with purely local hires. So converted very quickly again, once the kind of initial batch of stalwarts at CMSPI kind of moved across. It's now looking to kind of have that fully domestic setup.
And was there much resistance, or kind of questions from talent around brand, how long you were going to be in the market? It's been a risk-off environment for everybody the last 12 months. Has that been a challenge?
I don't think it was for us. I think generally we saw, and maybe this is biased from people that actually responded to our adverts, but generally we saw a lot of excitement about being in fintech, and certainly a lower hesitancy to joining a small kind of scale up, even as part of a larger global business. That was seen as more exciting than worrying that there'd be that opportunity for growth. And I think particularly, looking at some graduate hires, we're based in Tech Central as well, so we have kind of the universities around us. There was far more excitement, and even there was a session not too long ago where we had a room full of university students that were already thinking about their startup ideas. I think that mindset is changing, and again, maybe that's biases to who's answering our calls, but it seems like, particularly you've seen the explosion in growth of Afterpay and Zip coming from payments background. I think that's inspired quite a lot of people to look at the small, growing very quickly businesses to develop their careers as much as be part of an exciting organization.
And I guess those organizations as well have not only increased the talent pool, but as you say, have kind of normalized to an extent, startups and the risk to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Nick, we've seen, unfortunately, some businesses pull out of the region. And when I look at them, very successful businesses in their own right, had funding behind them, but perhaps had looked at Australia and were too early. Is there a case that, to be successful, you have to get the timing exactly right? Or is there, some kind of leeway there that you can maybe make a mistake around the timing of the entry?
You can definitely make mistakes because I've made lots of them. But I think this is another area where you need that first hire, and particularly country manager, general manager, whatever you want to call that role. They need to be able to put together a coherent go-to-market strategy. And perhaps more importantly than it being coherent, they need to be able to execute on it and do that successfully for your business to succeed here in Australia. The other thing I think, and maybe this is where you're sort of alluding to, is it's sometimes easy, I think, to come into Australia or look at the market from an external perspective and think, hey, really highly financialized economy. There's 27, 28 million people here, really early adopters of technology. We can go in there with this new product and we'll be sure to kill it. It's actually ruthlessly competitive. And I think a lot of people do underestimate that. All of the reasons why we're such early adopters mean we move on to new technology quite quickly, and none more so than in payments in the area that we operate in. So it's a mistake to underestimate just how competitive it is, and how tough it is potentially going to be. But having said that, if you get it right, there's obviously great rewards at the end of it, given the nature of our economy.
Robbie, I want to talk to you about the nature of businesses as well, because when you talk about fintech, you automatically assume it's either going to be a financial services business or a technology company. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole other market, which is support services, consulting, which, in my experience, I've actually seen those businesses possibly be the most successful here in Oz. What's been your experience as a kind of support services style business?
Yeah. So we have an interesting model where we're working kind of exclusively on a share of benefit that we deliver. So the profit kind of rev share model. And that, when you're starting to try and sell as a consulting business, has been quite helpful for us actually in building that trust with organizations that otherwise would be accustomed to maybe, standard retainer pieces for consulting. So our model kind of intrinsically is to prove ourselves first, and then you pay us. So I certainly think in payments, and again, our view is focused very much on the merchant side of things and how they're accepting payments from their customers. But fundamentally, there's quite a high barrier to changing setups in Australia. I would say more so than we've seen elsewhere in the world. There's a higher loyalty, I suppose, to your existing Big Four bank partner. And so wherever we've seen merchants that have long-standing relationships with the large banks in an area that maybe has been surpassed by fintech alternatives, there's quite a significant gap. And again, I think the reason that we launched in Australia, particularly for our kind of Asia Pacific hub now, rather than anywhere else, was that gap is largest here than we've seen in other markets that we've launched in, which leaves a gap for either new players to come in and sell their services, directly to the businesses in the fintech space and actually provides the solutions. Absolutely. Obviously, difficult to, again, kind of oust existing legacy relationships. But also that gap is significant enough that it allows for consulting partners to be able to provide that step change in knowledge and understanding to be able to then make a switch away or improve the kind of current services being offered. There is, and I'm sure that this will be the case in a number of other areas where, again, there's maybe been 20, 30, 40-year partnerships with a single provider. So, a similar thing with job hunting. Those that, maybe, or the common trope of if you move every 2 or 3 years, then, you're going to be seeing your salary increase massively. Staying potentially, it's difficult, or you have to be negotiating consistently to be able to get that. So same thing here. There's a lot of areas that I think are currently served relatively fine by legacy players, but a lot of opportunity elsewhere. And finding that gap can almost be a little bit scary for businesses in Australia, when it appears that there's such a kind of large leap to make. And if your internal infrastructure isn't set up to do that, it can be a bit of a leap of faith. So having a partner there that is a subject matter expert to be able to handhold through the opportunity. I think there is a lot of opportunity for supporting Australian business here, because once they understand the opportunity, they're actually usually quite quick to move. So it's been an interesting dynamic for us in that space, but certainly I think consulting and support services, there's a lot of areas where there'll be that large differential in what's done today and what could be done.
Yeah, cool. Nick, when I look at the businesses that have been successful, one thing that they've done extremely well has been to look at Australia in isolation and from a product perspective, be able to tailor their product, their offering to the local market. And if I look at businesses like Revolut now, who've been here, 3 and a bit years, starting to get a lot of traction, they're seeing Australia as kind of the launch pad for innovation. What's your sense as to the challenges around that product localization, and is it an easy thing to do?
I think it's very accurate. I think a lot of tech firms come down here and use Australia as a testing ground, for want of a better phrase. And again, I think it goes back to that point that Australians are pretty early adopters of technology and will try new things. In a regulated environment, I think, again, sort of having really strong partnerships with your banks is a good example of something where if you don't have that, trying to launch a new product and come in aggressively into the Aussie market can be a challenge. But if you have those strong relationships in place, then you come down and you can localize a product pretty effectively. That's probably all I have to add on that. Yeah.
As we come to a wrap up, what would be, I think, if you were advising anybody to come out, what would be the number one thing that you'd get them to focus on?
Again, it sort of comes back to your people. It's super important in terms of looking at what has been successful, say in a UK business, and then understanding that how are you going to execute on that strategy in Australia, but that needs to be done with a local person initially, and then that right person to cover off all of those things that I mentioned around launching the business here in Australia, but then most importantly be a carrier of the culture as well, of the organisation in the country. I think it's really easy for that to sort of go off the rails and cause problems if that first hire is not right. And then probably the follow-up answer to that is obviously to be really focused on the customers, because obviously without them, you won't have a business. And I think you've mentioned this on a couple of podcasts, but to the extent it is possible within some of the regulatory framework that's available here in Australia, to ideally have a number of customers on the ground already, that you've started to sort of sense check some of those hypotheses that originally drew you to launching in Australia and whether they're actually playing out.
And Robbie, what would be your kind of number one tip for anybody considering coming outdoors?
I think don't underestimate the amount of research and prepping that's required before a move. And I know everyone here obviously has done their investment in this trip exactly, but absolutely we spent 2 years learning and prepping and molding what the existing product looked like to get something that was ready for launch, and then launch it. So the kind of level of detail in planning for how you are actually launching is massive. And I'll very quickly say the other one being getting out and about and meeting people. Networking is always very important, particularly for startups and scale-ups. But here, attend the conferences, make connections, ask for referrals, even when there's, kind of tangential links between people. Most people in payments in particular know everyone else in payments. And so there will be somebody that knows, and leverage those relationships is a massive one that we've learned.
And I think that on that point, it's really important to remember that this is a really tight community as well. And so, slip-ups.
It goes the other way.
Can really, really damage opportunity.
Look after every one of your clients equally, because everybody knows everyone, and you can get the good and bad referrals.
Brilliant. Where can people find out more about Robbie?
So you can add me on LinkedIn or CMSPI.com.
I was going to say that because I had to.
So that's us. But always happy for a coffee now that I've learned to like it.
And Nick, where can people find out more about you and Currency Cloud?
Yeah, likewise, LinkedIn is the best place at a personal level. And of course, Currency Cloud. Our website is a good place to learn more about the organisation.
Well, thanks for tuning in, folks. As always, you can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. If you're coming back, thanks for supporting the show. And if you're new, hit that follow button in your podcast player. We release new episodes every week. Until the next time, keep well. Fintech Chatter is produced by Tier 1 people, leaders in fintech executive search. We'll find world-class leadership talent to build world-class fintech ventures. And you can find us at tier1people.com.